Shalom. This week we are reading Parshat Vayetze, beginning in 28th chapter of Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, and verse 10. And we're learning all about the patriarch Yaakov. Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our forefather. You know, each one of the patriarchs is such a different personality, each one from the next, and there's so much that we learn about the development of the people of Israel through the history of the patriarchs. As we know, the Torah is not about history, it's about our lives today. And that great principle, Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, that which befell the fathers is a sign for their children today. So we've been reading about Avraham, we've been reading about Yitzchak, and now we read as Yaakov flees from his brother Esav into the clutches of Lavan, from one trouble to the next. And this incredible parsha with so much happening, Parshat Vayetze, this is the beginning of the foundation of the establishment of the people of Israel. And it's amazing how each one of the patriarchs is so different. Abraham is all about chesed, about this overwhelming quality of loving kindness, and of course he is the one who was the master teacher, spiritual mentor for the whole world, brought the message of the one true God to the world. Yitzchak identified with the Gvura, with the aspect of awe of God, very passive, doesn't speak very much, never left the land of Israel, the one that was bound on the altar. And Yaakov, who had really so much aggravation in his life, who had to deal with so many external foes, who had to deal with so many different forces and had so much aggravation also throughout his life relating to his own children as well. And it's interesting how Hashem dealt with each one of the avot in a different way. And there are so many lessons to learn from each one of the patriarchs. And it's really part of the lesson is that we can never really just rely on what our fathers taught us. Each one of us has to discover who Hashem is on his own. And in the daily Shmona Esrei prayer, which we recite every day, the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei, the prayer of the 18 blessings, we say, "Blessed are you, Hashem." We say, "Our God and God of our fathers." Elokeinu ve'elokei avotenu. Our God and God of our fathers. The God of Avraham, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov. And one of the famous questions that's asked is, if we say that He is the God, our God and the God of our fathers, then why do we have to specify the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Yaakov? And one reason is because of this very thing. Because Abraham did not learn from his father. Yitzchak did not rely only on what he received as a legacy, as a tradition from Avraham. Yaakov did not rely on his conception for godliness only on what he learned from Yitzchak. He is our God and the God of our fathers, but he was an individual God. He was different for Avraham, for Yitzchak, or Yaakov, because the experience of being with Hashem and learning about Hashem and living a life dedicated to God is experiential. It's not something that can only be handed down. But even so, we find that there is a connection, a thread between all of the patriarchs. So Yaakov, in this week's Torah portion, comes to the Temple Mount. This is universally understood from the very beginning of the portion, that he comes to this place, and this is where Hashem arranged that he should lie down, in the very place of the Holy Temple, the very place where Avraham had bound his father Yitzchak, and there he sees the vision of the ladder. And so the Midrash tells us that he came there, and based on the verse that we find here in chapter 28, verse 11, how he took from the stones of the place, and he placed them under his head. You know, we always emphasize that when we study Midrash, that the words of our sages are so poetic, and they're so potent, and they have so much portent also. They're so loaded with meaning on so many different levels, and our sages employ poetic license and allegory and metaphor in order to drive home deep psychological as well as mystical principles and understanding of life, and not necessarily literal. So we always need to hone our skill when we study the beautiful words of the oral tradition, the Midrash, to try to understand what is the lesson that our sages are telling us. So based on this concept, this verse that tells us here in verse 11 that Jacob took from the stones of the place and placed them under his head, we find that one Midrash tells us that he took from the stones of the very altar upon which his father Yitzchak had been bound. And those are the stones which he placed under his head. And that is such a beautiful idea in itself, although not the main thing that I wanted to tell you, but that is such a beautiful idea because it's this concept of continuum. In other words, the great watershed event, the landmark in the history of the Jewish people is Akedat Yitzchak, and it changed everything forever. Our conception of how to serve God, our conception of dedication. Avraham bound Isaac on the altar, and Yaakov, who is really in many ways, the beginning of the establishment of the people of Israel. He has his 12 sons. What was his participation in Akedat Yitzchak? He got left out. He might look at that event and say, my father was tested, and my grandfather was tested. And what is my relationship with Hashem? How can I do that kind of kinyan? How can I make that kind of acquisition and show where I stand ready for God? And so Yaakov took from the stones of the place, of the very altar upon which his father Isaac had been bound, and placed them under his head to make kind of a statement that he is also there, that he's also participating in that event, that he also is ready to carry that through, as it were, that he is also part of the legacy of the binding. So that's one midrash, that he took from the stones of the very altar of Yitzchak, and those are the ones that he placed under his head. Then there's another midrash that tells us that he took these stones and he made a type of shelter around his head in order to protect himself from the wild beasts at night. Now, Yaakov, who is the archetype of the patriarchs, who is the very image of the beginning of the tikkun of man, do you really think that he was afraid of being mauled by wild beasts on the side of the holy temple at night as he lay his holy head down? I mean, another midrash tells us that the stones themselves were arguing over upon which stone would this tzaddik lay his head. That's why we find later that even though now it says he took from the stones, it says when he woke up, he took the stone and he poured oil over it, because they all unified, because they all were fighting, as it were, who's going to host the head of this righteous person. So whatever that means, it's obvious that Yaakov was not really concerned about being mauled or being attacked by some wild beasts. But yet, again, the Midrash is perfect and exists on such a rarefied level of symbol and metaphor for us to understand that there's no contradiction between any of these descriptions, that yes, he took from the stones of the altar of Yitzchak, and he also put something around his head to protect himself from wild beasts. And I'm thinking of two other psukim. One we had earlier in Parshat Vayera. When Avraham came back from the Akedah, from the binding, we find there in verse 14, chapter 22, the verse that tells us, and Avraham called the name of that site Hashem Yireh, as it is said this day, on the mountain Hashem will be seen. And I'm thinking of another verse that tells us earlier regarding the announcement of the birth of Yishmael. In chapter 16 and verse 12 we read, and he shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone's and everyone's against him. And when Avraham saw into the future, coming back from the Akedah, and dealing with the whole dichotomy of his two sons, his identity as Avraham, the father of the Jewish people, and his identity as he was in a previous life as Avram, who was the father of Ishmael, he looked into the future and he said, whoever rules this mountain is going to show the world how Hashem is seen, and how Hashem is to truly be worshipped, and how his name is to be made one. And those who are basically serving God here in this place, the place where I bound my son Isaac, are going to be proving that Hashem can be seen. This is all going to play out in the future on this place. In the mountain, Hashem will be seen. And so Yishmael, who is called a wild animal of a man, a wild ass of a man, and this in 1612, that prophecy in our time, we see how true that is. And Yaakov laying his head on the place of the altar, on the place of the holy temple, taking the stones from the altar upon which his father Yitzchak had been bound. In the Quran it says that Yishmael was bound. He took the stones upon which his own father Yitzchak had been bound And he established his continuum and his legacy and the hallmark of the tradition of the Jewish people, placed them under his head, and also as a protection against wild beasts, but not the lions and tigers and bears of the Wizard of Oz. That's not who he was worried about mauling him. He did that for protection against the wild beast of a man, who is Ishmael, because Abraham prophesies that in this place Hashem will be seen. And Yaakov, again, realized that the conflict on this place, on this very place, is going to be between his children and between the children of Ishmael. And this experience of Yaakov's is yet another link in the prophetic future of the destiny of this place. Hashem Yireh, in this mountain, Hashem will be seen, and the world will see what true fear and reverence and awe of God is, dependent on those who are serving God in this place.